Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, as we watch what is happening on the ground, as we watch what is happening within the circles of key Ukrainian leaders, such as the head of the Ukrainian ground forces, the chiefs of the general staff, it is becoming very apparent that the Ukrainians do not believe that they are going to have final success, that their perceived endgame, which is the removal of Russian forces from all areas of Ukraine, is achievable. It's not going to happen unless the Ukrainians are given an air force. Very apparent. The battles that are taking place right now, especially in the south, are incredibly bloody, incredibly costly for the Ukrainian military. They do not have an air force. The Russians have an air force. It is not going to work for the Ukrainians if they have ideas of moving down towards Melitopol, Berdyansk, or even Tokmak. It's really just not going to happen at this point. Furthermore, we're seeing the reinforcing of Russian lines, specifically Bakhmut, for instance. Just 2 months ago, we were seeing about 25,000 Russian troops operating within the vicinity to the north, to the south, and in and near Bakhmut itself. Currently, it is estimated that the Russians have a core size element of 50,000 troops, 300 tanks, hundreds of armored fighting vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, and over 100 multiple launch rocket systems within the vicinity of Bakhmut. Very difficult situation for the Ukrainians as they continue to try to press operations near Bakhmut. They are facing twice as many forces as they were facing just 2 months ago. Now, we've received information about new Russian weapon systems operating over Ukraine, specifically Sumy, in this area here. Now, there was a photograph taken of this new weapon system, and we're trying to identify exactly what weapon system this was. Obviously, this war has been going on for over a year. The Russians are not sitting idle. The Russians are developing new weapon systems. They are capturing Western equipment. They are analyzing some of that Western equipment, and we anticipate we will see copies of some of that Western equipment being deployed against the West. But specifically, this weapon system over Sumy was a unmanned combat aerial vehicle, a heavy unmanned combat aerial vehicle. We believe that it is the Russian S-70 Hunter. This is a very large drone. It has the capability of carrying up to 4 tons of ordnance and weapons in its 2 bomb bays. We'll look at a better picture of this system here. This will give you a better idea of just how large this system is. And what we're hearing is the Russians may have up to 4 of these systems now in operation. We know they have 2 flyable systems that are in the air, with 2 more updated systems that have been further modified that the Russians could operate. Now, the weapon systems that are launched from the S-70 Hunter is a variety of weapon systems, ground attack munitions. And if we look here, this is the KH-59 Mark II. This is an upgraded version of the KH-59, which the Russians have been using throughout this conflict. But this is a more stealthier design that has fire and forget capabilities that we believe are also being used within the confines of this conflict. It may have been recently used in ground attack operations in and around Sumy, Ukraine. And we suspect that the Russians will continue to build, upgrade, and deploy these systems as the war continues. And we'll kind of go back to that original photograph. And again, this is the early stage development of the Russian S-70 Hunter. Now, what is actually being fielded right now in the air that is operating over Ukraine, that is operating over southern Russia, may look quite a bit different than this photograph that is being displayed. But nonetheless, we believe at this point the Russians are operating a system very similar to this drone. So it's interesting to see that. And obviously, as we get more information about the deployment of this weapon system, we will, of course, have more. Back to the main map. Again, you can see in terms of the narrative that is coming out of this conflict, you can hear U.S. generals, you can hear leaders from the Pentagon discussing what is happening on the ground. They are creating this narrative that things are moving very slowly. And they are creating this narrative that things must go very slowly given the nature of the conflict. The Ukrainians themselves are saying this is an incredibly bloody conflict. Every 500 meters, every 1,000 meters of territory that the Ukrainians take is costing the Ukrainians lives, Ukrainian military personnel lives. And it's not going to get any easier for the Ukrainian military. You have to understand the Russians are continuing to mobilize, continuing to deploy new weapon systems, the likes of which I just talked about, such as the S-70, and that's just one system. There are other systems on track right now that the Russians are manufacturing, researching, and developing that are going to be deployed in this conflict that we have not seen yet. The size of the Russian ground forces is expanding, hence what is happening near Bakhmut. I think at this point, realistically, Bakhmut is off the table for the Ukrainians to retake, given the amount of forces that have been deployed into Bakhmut, 50,000 Russian forces, 300 tanks. And compounding that, the Russians are digging in. And the more that they dig in, the more that they entrench, the more fortifications that they position in this area, the more difficult it is for the Ukrainians to try and retake Bakhmut. And I think right now the Russians are perfectly happy to let the Ukrainians expend themselves on these fortifications. Go to the actual fortification screen. That is not the fortification screen. And you can see that we are seeing multiple lines of fortifications. Obviously, behind Bakhmut, if we go from Bakhmut to the center of Bakhmut to the first major line of Russian defensive positions, that's 20 kilometers behind Bakhmut. Now what they're doing is the Russians are pushing up and then creating another line of defensive areas near Bakhmut, closer to Bakhmut. And in all probability, there will be a third line that will be positioned in between Bakhmut and this main defensive line. But we think right now the Russians are positioning themselves for a very large offensive operation. Again, we've talked about this before, that is going to take place in the not too distant future. And you have to look at this area near Seversk. You've got this large buildup of Russian forces to the north of Seversk. You've got another buildup of Russian forces within the vicinity of Bakhmut. So large formation of Russian forces here. Large formation of Russian forces here. And then look at this. Look at this Seversk pocket. The Russians may be preparing for a very large-scale enveloping operation to envelop Ukrainian forces in this Seversk pocket, while at the same time focusing on an operation pushing towards the north side of Sloviansk, in the south approach to Kramatorsk, while at the same time pocketing these Ukrainian forces near Seversk. Now, do we know that's going to happen? We do not. But that is the way things are shaping up right now. It looks like the Russians are preparing for offensive operations in this area. And I've talked about this before. Watch Seversk, north and south of Seversk. The Ukrainians are expending a lot of blood, a lot of equipment, a lot of material in this failed offensive in the south. So could we see a right hook in the north by Russian forces after the Ukrainians expend themselves in the south? And it's not going good in the south for the Ukrainians. They have not gotten close to any of these major Russian defensive lines just to the south, just about 10 to 13 kilometers south of where the line of contact is right now. And again, the Russian military is expanding, continuing to expand. And in 2 months, there's going to be more Russian forces in the theater of operation than there are now. 25,000 just 2 months ago in Bakhmut, 50,000 now. Not a good situation for the Ukrainians. So we'll continue our coverage. Thank you for joining us today. More to come. And as always, have a good day.